So, strategy, planning, and assessment frameworks. Let's talk about some of the oldest frameworks so you can get a view of where we've come from. And the first one, classic Porter's five forces. So, what's an assessment framework? Well, when you're doing strategy planning, at some point a business decides it needs rigorous strategy, it needs a business strategy. Not all businesses have a strategy. This is crazy. They let their operating model just sort of materialize and they do one step, one foot in front of the other, and somehow manage to keep the doors open, sometimes purely by chance, sometimes by amazing capabilities of execution. However, at some point, in order to continue to grow, or in some cases, just to stave off the competition, a business has to come to some understanding of strategy because they need to create one. They need to articulate their business model. And that's where a lot of strategy planning begins is, well, what's your business model? Uh, and that can be one part of the assessment. A company may not truly understand their business model. It happens. So what would they have to do in order to understand their business model? Well, one really critical piece of understanding your business model and starting to figure out where you are as a company from a strategic standpoint is look around. Look around at the environment you exist in. So this is one, and I'm going to start here. This is one way to begin the strategy planning and strategy assessment process using this assessment framework, which is based on Porter, who is a professor at Harvard, I believe. Porter's five forces. Now, what are the five forces? First, competitive rivalry. How competitive is the market? How many people does the company compete with? You'll realize there are so many companies out there that it's almost impossible. If you're in a heavily saturated, that means a market where you are competing with tons of other companies, it can be hard to keep track of everyone. And in some cases, it may not be worth your time to keep track of everyone you could possibly be competing with right now. And so that can be a lengthy piece. What competitors are out there? How competitive is the marketplace? How many competitors could you potentially run into if you were selling a customer a pair of shoes? Tons. There are tons of different shoe brands out there, and every type of shoe possible has hundreds and hundreds of choices that can all be delivered in 2 days. Highly competitive marketplace. When you look at power, so your electricity, not a lot of competition there because there are some regulatory constraints and they have somewhat of a monopoly in different places. There is an actual monopoly that is protected by governmental regulations or just the amount of money it takes to create a new utility. So there are some industries where there are tons of competitors and some there aren't. So that's your first force is competitive rivalry. Now, supplier power. If I have to make, let's say I'm making this shirt and there's only one supplier in the world who makes the materials for this shirt, well, that supplier has quite a bit of power, wouldn't you say? If there are tons of people who need this very same material, there's only one supplier. That supplier has an enormous amount of power to set the price for that material and to decide who they want to supply to, how much they want to supply. And so that makes it difficult for my business if my suppliers have a significant amount of power. However, if this is, and I'm very sure it is, an easy to source material that anyone who does fabrics could create, well, then I, as a buyer, have alternatives. I'm going to switch this around in just a second. And so I can choose to go to any supplier. Therefore, my suppliers don't have a whole lot of power. And so it's easy to get the materials that I need. It is easy to get them at a stable price and to not worry about scarcity or additional costs. And so suppliers could have a lot of power or not a lot of power. And that obviously impacts strategy planning process, how I plan and operate. In many cases also impacts the operating model. Now, buyer power, this is the reverse. If I sell a product just like the supplier sells to me, if I sell to customers or I sell to other businesses, now we start thinking about them as buyers. How many alternatives to my product exist? If I am the power company, well, I kind of have a monopoly. There's not a whole lot of alternatives. Whereas if I make shoes, there are tons of alternatives. So there is some level of buyer power. But if you think about Nike, Nike has made a small niche for themselves in making exclusive sneakers that all of a sudden, that buyer power, that threat of substitution, using their brand, they've been able to counter the massive market of substitutes that are out there by making their product exclusive. So they've used a strategy. Why are they so concerned about brand? Why are they so heavily focused on certain shoes? And why don't they make enough for everyone to have every one of their shoes? Well, the strategy behind that explains why they do those things that they do. It's because they want to counteract some of the buyer power that we have as buyers to allow them to charge a premium price point or to create scarcity or any number of different reasons that could lead to them making more money and supporting their business model or operating model. So that's buyer power. Now, what's the threat of substitution? Very similar. If I buy a pair of Nikes, well, what if somebody else were able to make the exact same pair? They have some trademarks and some patents and some things that would prevent anyone else from making exactly the same shoe. However, if you don't really have a strong brand loyalty or brand preference, a shoe's a shoe, right? So there is some threat of substitution, and there are some measures that they can take in order to prevent people from substituting their product. But if you think about milk, the threat of substitution for milk is it's milk. There's no real differentiator in most, dairy products like milk. Not a lot of differentiation there that's possible. It's milk, it's milk. And so the threat of substitution there is extraordinarily high. If I have 4 brands of milk and it's all the same milk, what's going to incentivize me to buy one over another? Probably price. Price is probably the thing that you're going to compete on. And so your customers, as a result of a high level of substitution, will likely be very price sensitive. They will likely be very quality sensitive. All of the things that make your margins shrink when there are many direct substitutes, well, you are struggling on price. You're basically very constrained when it comes to margins by what your competitors are willing to charge as well. Now, finally, threat of new entry. That's your 5th force. How likely and how easy is it for someone to enter the marketplace? And, when you think about something like power, it's hard. How much would it really cost to run power to every household that wanted it from scratch? It's a lot of money. And so there's a barrier to entry to providing power plants and offering them directly to consumers. There's barriers to entry. And so in some markets, it's difficult. The threat of new entry is very, very low. But what are the barriers to creating a new line of milk? Well, if you can buy a dairy farm and build up the distribution, you can do it. And so the barrier to entry there is just the cost and the logistics and the know-how that it would take to start up another dairy and successfully enter the marketplace. So threat of entry there is high. So that obviously plays into your business strategy. And so it's an assessment framework. You can hear it's pretty rudimentary, isn't it? There's not a lot to this. It's rigid. It doesn't really work when you think about the modern competitive landscape. It doesn't really work so well. But if you're a business just starting out with strategy, especially a small business in a marketplace that maybe isn't that competitive, and Porter's 5 Forces is a very valid place to do your first strategy planning session from. Makes sense. It's a good evaluation framework, and it'll help you understand not only the competitive landscape in the marketplace, but it can also help you refine your business model, your operating model, and find some opportunities for growth, identify some threats to your continued growth or even continued survival of your business. Now, Porter's 5 Forces turned into Porter's 6 Forces at some point along the way. And so the 6 forces Competition, new entrants, which we talked about, end users and buyers. That's about the same thing as buyer power, but slightly updated and modernized. You have suppliers, again, suppliers, same thing, supplier power, substitutes, threat of substitution, about the same, and complementary products. Now, complementary products is a new thing that you understand what a complementary product is. If I buy a printer, a complementary product would be ink. Or if I buy a computer, the printer could be a complementary product. And that's just one example, and there's tons of them. So I'm not going to dive too deep into what a complementary product is and all of the different variations on complementary products, but you get the picture. There is a different understanding of products, product lines, and how, in some cases, competition can be beneficial if you partner with someone that you looked at as a competitor before to do something like offering complementary products or acquiring a competitor who offers a better complementary product to improve your operations. So now we got 6 forces, but it's basically 5 forces with different wording. So that's your first strategy planning framework. Porter's 5 and then 6 eventually forces. This gives you a little bit of an idea of how companies at their very, I guess, most basic strategy planning phases or strategy planning maturity begin to think about how do I assess my business model? How do I assess what's going on in the broader marketplace? How do I begin to understand the complexity of this industry that I work in, the products that I build, the customers, what they want, how they think? And you can see this gets very, very deep. And some of the work that you might have done as a data scientist probably touches on pieces of understanding how to build out core strategy. So that's Porter's 5 forces. We'll talk about another framework in subsequent videos and more assessment methodologies and thought processes. But this is a good introduction. It's one of the oldest, best understood strategy frameworks. Porter's 5 and then eventually 6 forces.